Hello and welcome to Stories Behind the Songs. I'm your host Jim Tompkins. In each episode we uncover the fascinating backstories behind iconic rock and pop tracks. Today we'll delve into James Taylor's Fire and Rain. This timeless ballad is not only the song that launched James Taylor's career, but it's also the song that helped ignite the singer-songwriter movement of the 1970s. Fire and Rain isn't just a song, it's a heartfelt journey that captures the mood and spirit of a troubled young man. As we unwind the layers, we'll also explore the tremendous stroke of luck that helped shape the destiny of one of the era's most influential artists. To set the stage, let's transport ourselves back to late 1969. James Taylor is in Hollywood and poised to record his second album, the album that would spawn Fire and Rain. Surrounding him is a legendary cast of characters that would be as important as any other within the singer-songwriter movement, the classic rock era, and beyond. Among them, a former pop star working with the Beatles as a director at Apple Records, a fabulously successful songwriter who would go on to record one of the greatest selling albums in the history of the world, and three of the great session players of the classic rock era. But in terms of the album session itself, there was nothing extraordinary about it. James had the songs, and in just a few days the crew had recorded perhaps his greatest album, Sweet Baby James. What is more extraordinary, and really what this story is about, is what it took for James Taylor to get to that point, which is what Fire and Rain is all about. Let's unfold that narrative now. James Taylor is born in Massachusetts in 1948, but he grows up in North Carolina. He has a seemingly idyllic childhood as one of four siblings, but his troubles begin when he's packed off to Milton Academy in Massachusetts as a teenager. The school is a bad fit for him, and soon it triggered a wave of depression and thoughts of suicide. After confiding his issues to a friend, he's admitted to McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. He doesn't want to be there, but he sees this as an escape from both Milton Academy and the looming draft amid the Vietnam War. When the draft board does call, he orchestrates an odd but effective strategy, having an attendant and a friend don white orderly clothes, stand by his side and answer all the questions for him. In his words, he receives a clean bill of poor mental health. After slipping out of McLean, he winds up on the bustling streets of New York, where he reunites with his childhood friend Danny Korchmar, a.k.a. Cooch. Together they form a band called The Flying Machine. He and Cooch try their hand at writing and recording, but the effort doesn't pan out, and it's in New York that he first encounters the darkness of heroin addiction. After an SOS call to his family, his father intervenes and whisks him back to North Carolina. He hangs out in North Carolina for a bit, he gets clean, but then decides he needs a change of scenery. He has a friend who's living in London who agrees to put him up. He convinces his parents to buy him a plane ticket, and across the Atlantic he goes. He has no real plans in London, but this decision would turn out to be the defining point of his life. His old friend Cooch has a contact in London named Peter Asher. Peter Asher was one half of a duo called Peter and Gordon that had a big hit with a Paul McCartney song called World Without Love. Cooch had met them on one of their U.S. tours when he got recruited to be part of their touring band. When James Taylor moves to London, Peter Asher has just been named head of A&R for the Beatles' newly formed Apple Records. He gets Asher's number from Cooch, calls him up, gets an audition, and within a few days is playing his songs in front of Paul McCartney and George Harrison. The result was the break of the century as he signed to a recording contract. In the spring of 1968, while the Beatles are down the hall recording their White Album, James Taylor records his debut album. This effort produces classics such as Carolina on My Mind and Something in the Way She Moves. Unfortunately, James has once again picked up his drug habit, and he's in no shape to promote the album. He's dropped from Apple Records, and Peter Asher is also swept out after Alan Klein takes control of the Beatles and cleans house. But it was that association with the Beatles and Apple that would pay big dividends in the future. Now James heads back to the U.S., where he comes face to face with the fact that the heroin habit is back, and he checks himself into the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts. It's within the confines of the hospital, with plenty of time on his hands, that he completes the composition of Fire and Rain. He'd actually started it while in London recording that first album, and had the first verse written. Tragically, the inspiration came when James learned of the suicide of a good friend from New York, Susan Schnurr.
Just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone. Suzanne, the plans they made put an end to you.
His friends had held off telling him about Susan's death because they didn't want to disturb his state of mind while he was recording his album. What's interesting is that soon after the song was released, James had reservations about the line, Suzanne, the plans they made put an end to you. He was concerned at how her family might take that, as if he was blaming them. From almost the very first performances of Fire and Rain, he changes the lyric to "Suzanne, the planes you made put an end to you," which he still does to this day. It's while he's back in Massachusetts at Austin Riggs that he completes the final two verses of the song, the middle verse referencing his battle with heroin addiction and his time at the hospital.
Won't you look down upon me, Jesus? You gotta help me make a stand. You just got to see me through another day.
The third verse recalls his failed attempt at stardom with the flying machine, as well as his thoughts and plans for the future while he's biding his time at Austin Riggs.
Been walking my mind to an easy time, my back turned towards the sun. Lord knows when the cold wind blows, it'll turn your head around. Well, as I was...
In an interview on NPR, he reflected on the genesis of Fire and Rain. It did come very, very fast, but it was a great relief. It relieved a lot of tension. There were things that I needed to get rid of, or at least get out of me, or get in front of me, or at least have some other relationship than feeling them internally, either by telling somebody else or by just putting them out in a form in front of me so that I could say, there they are, externalizing it somehow. And that part was hard, having the feelings that needed to be expressed in that way. But it was actually a relief, like a laugh or a sigh. It's after James leaves Austin Riggs that he heads to California, where he's reunited with Peter Asher. Due to their shared history with the Beatles and Apple Records, they're able to secure a contract with Warner Brothers. And it's there in Hollywood that the legendary ensemble of James, Peter Asher, Carole King, Danny Korchmar, Russ Kunkel, and Leland Sklar sit down to record the album Sweet Baby James that would help launch the singer-songwriter movement. In James Taylor's own words, "We nailed it down so fast. I'd play a song for Carole King in the morning, and we'd go straight to the studio and we'd play it for Danny Korchmar. And then the three of us would put it down with Russ Kunkel on drums. We were just living on the surface, like one of those water striders that can walk on the surface tension of a pond. It felt like we were just right on the surface of ourselves." The album Sweet Baby James is recorded in just a few days. One of the reasons they were so productive is that James had months to fine-tune the songs after recovering from a motorcycle accident on Martha's Vineyard. "It sort of forced me to wait and then go into the studio when I was more than enough prepared," he said in 2015. Danny Korchmar recalled to Rolling Stone magazine that they'd tried to cut a fuller-sounding electric version of Fire and Rain almost a year before. "We were playing it like a rock band. Peter Asher figured out after that version that it had to be scaled back. When Peter took everything out, the song finally came to life." And James reflected on the collaborative approach he took. "But really the way these songs were recorded is that I have a community of musicians I work with. I give them the chords and play them my arrangements of it. Then they find things to play that work with it. I never write out whole arrangements." The album Sweet Baby James is released on February 1, 1970. Strangely, Fire and Rain was not picked as the first or even the second single from the album. And perhaps the reason is that most of the songs on the album were lighter, more uplifting songs. Sweet Baby James was released first, but didn't chart. Country Road was then released and peaked at number 37. In the meantime, both R.B. Greaves and Johnny Rivers decided to release their versions of Fire and Rain, with James's finally hitting the airwaves in August. By early November, it soared to the number 3 spot, which would be its peak. James was very surprised at the success. He had no idea that such a deeply personal song would appeal to listeners, as he didn't think people were interested in his life. Beyond catapulting James Taylor to stardom, Fire and Rain marked a watershed moment in the singer-songwriter movement. Prior to this time, most songs were either written and performed by bands, or if it was a solo act, they relied on professional songwriters. There were obvious exceptions to this, like Bob Dylan, but as a movement it really hit stream in 1970 with Fire and Rain. In quick succession, the decade of the 70s would see a cavalcade of successful singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell, Elton John, Billy Joel, Gordon Lightfoot, and of course, Carole King. Today, Fire and Rain is an enduring classic and James Taylor's most famous song. It was a hit in 1970 when it was released, and it's his most popular song today. It's been covered over 100 times by artists such as John Denver, Johnny Rivers, Herb Alpert, Anita Bryant, Cher, Willie Nelson, and Babyface. More than that, it was perfectly appropriate in its place and time, poetically describing the troubles that young James Taylor had been through by the time he was only 20 years old. And I think that's what people feel when they hear the song. They hear the singer bearing his soul and perhaps can then reflect in on themselves and the challenges that they have faced. That wraps up the story behind Fire and Rain. I thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and hit the subscribe button, and I'll be back soon with another story behind a great rock and roll song.